Okay, I'm going to lecture here regarding Herbert Hoover. I'm going to get through all of section 3 and then see how far I get in section 4 regarding the Great Crash, the Great Depression. You'll have a quiz on this lecture that I will put on Moodle, and the quiz will be based solely uh, on this lecture. All right. This course, the Great Depression and World War II, actually starts not with World War II, but with the Great Depression. And you already took a quiz on the 1920s. And during the 1920s, the times were very good. The economy was strong, the country was prosperous. And during the 1920s, the Republicans dominated national politics. There were 3 Republican presidents during the 1920s. Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover was the third of them. Herbert Hoover will be elected president in 1929 when the economy is still doing exceptionally well. But that won't be the case during the rest of his presidency beginning in the fall of 1929. And he will be blamed for the Depression and his apparent failure to respond to it or fix it. All right, Hoover. Herbert Hoover was born to a Quaker family in Iowa. His mother and father died when he was just very young. He attended Stanford University, a new university out in California, did very well, studying engineering. He traveled around the world, like Australia, where he found many minerals and other things, became quite wealthy. He was always industrious, hardworking. Now, Hoover, when World War I broke out in 1914, was in England. And at the time when Germany invaded Belgium, there was England declared war on Germany, and all of a sudden Europe was at war. And Hoover later wrote, I did not realize it at the moment, but on August 3rd, 1914, my engineering career was over forever. I was on the slippery road of public life. What occurred was when Germany invaded this country of Belgium, all of a sudden Belgium, which was a neutral country, had a catastrophe on its hands. Its civilian population in particular was hurting, starving. There were reports of German atrocities, and what Herbert Hoover did when he was in London at the time was help raise relief funds for Belgium. He established a commission for the relief of Belgium. During World War I, he became a hero all throughout of Europe for his humanitarian efforts in making sure that the civilian populations that were displaced during the war would be fed. And this is where he earns the nickname the Great Humanitarian. On Belgium, he's still seen as a national savior for organizing a World War I relief effort, credited with saving millions from starving. Now, the United States will join World War I in 1917 when it declared war on Germany. And President Woodrow Wilson asked Hoover to be the director of the United States Food Agency, in which Hoover does, and he tries to persuade Americans to cut back, to on certain days not eat meat. He wants the country the population to contribute to the war effort. And by all accounts, he does another exceptional job. And by this time, he is a national figure in the United States, extremely popular, like he was in Europe. After the war, he created an American Relief Administration. This committee raised funds again to feed people mostly in Eastern Europe, including this new Soviet Union, who were, again, starving from the after effects of World War One. You can see the committee fed over 300 million people in 20 countries with 34 million tons of food. He attends something known as the Versailles, the treaty negotiations in Paris, which we'll talk much more in depth about um, in this class. And he emerges again even more of a statesman from his role during the peace negotiations. Now, a lot of people thought maybe Herbert Hoover could run for president in 1920. He declines, but he is appointed in 1921 by the new president, Warren Harding, to be Commerce Secretary. And he will serve as Commerce Secretary from 1921 to 1928. The Commerce Building still today bears his name. There was a flood in 1927. Hoover provided enormous relief for people. Again, he was just a man of action and energy. And again, he had this name, the nickname, the Great Humanitarian. And he just always seems to be able to come through and help people and save people. Now, by 1928, he is so popular, the Republican Party asks him to be their nominee for president. He accepts. And he says unemployment in the sense of distress is widely disappearing, which was largely true. We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. The poorhouse is vanishing from among us. What he was saying was correct. I mean, America in 1928 was richer than any other country in the world. There was a broad middle class. Times were great. Poverty was declining. And there was a sense of optimism that this would continue. Hoover wins the 1928 election in a landslide. He succeeds Calvin Coolidge, who was riding in a limousine with on Inauguration Day, March 4th, 1929. Back then, the inaugural was in March. And he says in his inaugural address, if we survey the situation of our nation both at home and abroad, we find many satisfactions. We find some causes for concern. We have emerged from the losses of the Great War and the Reconstruction following it with increased virility and strength. From this strength, we have contributed to the recovery and progress of the world. What America has done is given renewed hope and courage to all who have faith in government by the people. In the large view, we have reached a higher degree of comfort and security than ever existed before in the history of the world. This again is true. What he's saying is the United States, materially, financially, economically, is stronger than any country had ever been in the history of the world, and most of its people are enjoying it. Again, there's a consumer culture, there's modern conveniences, indoor plumbing, electricity in people's homes, the automobile, they're in a car. I mean, this is the ultimate status of American economic might. There's radio, movies, sporting events. Unemployment is very low. Inflation is virtually non-existent. 1928-29, everything looked great. And he says here, this is he and his wife on March 4th, 1929, making their way to the White House. From this strength, we have contributed to the recovery and progress of the world. What America has done is given renewed hope and courage to all who have faith in government by the people. In the large view, we have reached a higher degree of security than ever existed during the history of the world. I said that already, sorry. But It's true. Uh, Again, he becomes president in 1929. His vice president is Charles Curtis. He has a strong cabinet. He doesn't work very well with Congress and some other things. Um, Virtually no one saw the Depression coming. There were some who warned that maybe times aren't so strong. Maybe there's some underlying issues of the economy. But in March of 1929, everything was good. Turn to section 4. The American and the economy in the 1920s, as I was saying, everything in March of 1929 was good. For the most part, the 1920s, everything was great. It was the most prosperous era in American history. And again, the United States has a stronger economy than any other country in the world. It emerged from World War I as the world's dominant power. There was no doubt of that. The biggest and strongest economy had all the industrial resources: steel, oil, coal, iron, ore, everything. It was making more cars than the rest of the world combined. There was mass production. There were consumer goods. People were buying refrigerators. They were buying cars. They were buying new homes, radio, washing machines, and technology. And if you bought a new home in the 1920s, it just again, it was equipped with electricity, running water, indoor plumbing. You would have a radio in the house. Homes now were heated. Air conditioning would come later on. Americans bought cars. The technology was just staggering. I mean, it was just 1920s are often called the birth of modernism, the modern times. And the American dollar was the strongest currency. Hollywood really grew. The first most talking picture was 1927, but the movies were just so popular. I mentioned sporting events like baseball, boxing, the advertising agency. People are now traveling. There are vacations. All these things are part, as you see here, technology. By 1930, 70% of American industry was powered by electricity. By 1925, a completely assembled Model T rolled off the assembly line every 10 seconds. General Motors, Ford, Chrysler were just, again, these enormous corporations that built new cars. Americans could afford cars. The middle class could afford cars. You put a down payment, pay off installments. Sales in automobiles rose from 1.9 million to 5 million, 1.9 million in 1920 to 5 million in 1929. There were 26 million automobiles in America, in the United States, in 1929. By 1925, a car that cost 2 years' wages a decade earlier, 1915, cars were just for the rich, was about 3 months of wages. It's very affordable. I'm going to talk much more about farming later on. The problem for farmers was that they were producing too much because of electricity, because of the tractor. Produce so much more. And when you produce so much more, well, prices go down. And that really hurt farmers. And now, because so many Americans have refrigeration, they don't need to constantly replenish everything every day. So the food could last longer. So ironically, even though Americans are eating more and there's more food available and farmers are producing so much, farmers are really hurting because prices are going down. And farmers will go into debt, and this will be a key cause of the Great Depression. The two biggest things about an economy even today are new home sales and sale of automobiles. Today it's weird because we have a shortage of everything. But in the 1920s, the car and the houses just spurred on this economic growth, and people could afford to build new homes, and buy new cars. And you get the development of suburbs. People can now drive to work because of cars. 5.16 billion was spent on new home construction in 1925. That might not seem like lots. It was an enormous amount. Again, the people are going to banks. They're getting mortgages. They're able to pay for it. But that will decline later on. And again, it will talk more about why these things decline. The consumer economy that was part of the economic strength. Americans during the 1920s just bought stuff. They just purchased. Thank you. They could afford to. Credit really becomes part of the economy. Now, credit cards don't come in the 1950s, but what companies do is, like General Motors, Ford, instead of you paying everything up front, which is usually the case, you now, to a major corporation, if you bought a car, you put a down payment and then paid interest. This is how you buy refrigerators. This is when you buy an RCA radio. This is how you pay. You could pay it all at once, but the majority of people put a down payment and pay interest in the same way in many things you do today. Real wages rose for workers. From 1929 to 1927, wages were rising. That's key. Wages are rising, so people are buying more. Employment is low. They have money. They're spending. You see, by 1929, 85% of furniture, 80% of radios, and 75% of washing machines were bought on credit. Again, that will catch up to people. All of these, the consumerism, the buying of goods, the traveling, vacations, low unemployment, low inflation, cars, homes, radios. The fact that America had an abundance of natural resources, oil, coal, that were very cheap. America's exporting things. People from other countries who can afford it are buying American goods. America, everything is strong. And the stock market boomed in the late 1920s. And even though only 4 million out of 120 million Americans own stock, the people who own stock from 1925 to 1929 made a fortune. Everything is great. But there were underlying issues in the American economy that all go together. Beginning in the fall of 1929, when the stock market crashes, those factors will go in a circle, which will create the Great Depression, because these underlying issues no one saw coming, but they're all related. What happens is once the stock market collapses, which does not cause the Great Depression, it's a spark, it's an underlying factor. Beginning in the fall of 1929, the stock market crashes and the economy, there were issues, and those issues all start coming to the surface. And what you get is the Great Depression. And in my next lecture, I will talk about the causes of the Great Depression and then Hoover's response. So you'll have a quiz just on what I've talked about so far, and this will end this lecture.